Welcome, friends, to the Redbud podcast. I'm the president of Redbud Writers Guild. My name is Dorina Lazo, Gilmore-Young, and I am so delighted that I get the chance to lead this nonprofit organization, which is designed by women for Christian women writers and communicators. So we envision a vibrant and a diverse movement of Christian women who get to create in community and who influence culture and faith through our words. And I'm really excited today to be able to welcome one of my Redbud sisters and longtime friends to the studio. Her name is Adriel Booker, and she is a writer, speaker, and curator exploring what she calls middle things, like how change and transition, crisis, or liminal space shape our lives in good and meaningful ways if we stay in the tension long enough to meet God and ourselves there. So I have known her over a decade and been following her work from afar. She has become a trusted voice both inside and outside of the church, most often writing and speaking into themes of faith and doubt, grief and loss, relationships, identity, the generosity of storytelling, creativity, and what it means to be found and loved, which are all themes that are dear to my heart as well. Adriel served in full-time vocational ministry for more than 20 years and yet believes the best and truest spiritual formation and life happen when we gather around the table. She's the author of 2 books, Grace Like Scarlet and her newest, Tethered to Hope, and appeared in places such as Christianity Today and ABC Religion and Ethics. She's living with her husband and 3 sons among the gum trees and sea breezes of a small town in Fleurieu Peninsula, Australia. Perhaps our guest who has lived the farthest away. And together they own and operate a cafe, a vintage shop, and a studio for creatives. So I want to welcome Adriel into the Redbud studio. And I wonder, friend, if you would just tell people a little bit more about the season of life that you are in.
Hi, Dorina. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here on Redbud territory. Yeah, so the season of life I'm in is, book launch season. I've just launched my second book. And as you know, that's a pretty intense time. My husband and I opened a new business about a year ago. So our new business it still feels like a baby business. It's not a newborn anymore. It's got the neck support. It's okay. It's not as fragile, but it's definitely still requiring a lot of our time and focus and effort and energy and all the things. So it's a cafe vintage shop and studio. And yeah, it's really wonderful. We worked in full-time ministry for almost 25 years. Things started to shift for us around COVID. And then we had several years really of a long transition where we felt like it was time to wrap up that season of our life and enter a new one. And like most transitions, it did not happen overnight. It was gradual with some large changes in the midst of that. So we were living in Sydney, which like inner city, and we moved interstate to a really small coastal town. Really, for affordability was our main motivator. We wanted to buy a house where older kids are teens, and we just wanted to feel like we had a place that could be more permanent and escape some of the rental insecurity, the housing insecurity of Sydney. So I miss it every single day. I love living in the city, but this was the best move for us. And moving here allowed us to really do some things that, we had dreamed of. So for us, one of those things was opening this little business that we had dreamed of for more than 10 years. So we just opened last year and things are going really well. I think in the midst of that, I was trying to write and finish Tethered to Hope and get that little book baby out into the world. So I'm really relieved now that Tethered is out there doing its thing. But yeah, it's been a challenging season as I've tried to sort of juggle what feels like 2 full-time jobs with my writing and yeah, with our business. So here I am.
That is a lot. And I appreciate just hearing a little bit of the journey. I think it helps our listeners to kind of have a grounding of the place that you're in your life, but also location. And I want to get into talking a little bit more about your book, Tethered to Hope. because I know it has been a journey. And I wonder if you would share a little bit more about kind of the inspiration behind this book and what the process was like for you in writing this book.
Mhm. Well, when I signed with my publisher years ago, I signed a two-book deal. So Grace Like Scarlet came out in 2018. And, I had planned on my second book. Um, we thought there would be a couple of years in between, which is pretty standard. I had several ideas for where my next book would go, but it wasn't nailed down yet. And I will never never forget this conversation we were having in our living room with a friend. And he was similar age to us, a few years younger. Didn't He wasn't married at the time, didn't have any children at the time we did. And he was talking about how within our ministry circles, he was talking about how he could often see women in particular kind of hit this stage where after they had children, he saw that they would hit this stage and be really confused about who they were and what they wanted to do with their lives. And I was listening to him thinking, for one, it was really interesting that he was picking this up. But I was also kind of listening to the way he was processing and digesting this change that he would see his friends go through and other ministry colleagues. And yeah, it really got me thinking about how identity shifts at different stages in our lives. And I think that way back then was this little seed of, okay, I know I want to write into something to do with this identity shifts. And then fast forward many years, when we got to COVID, so I was writing, and then we got to COVID and everything changed. I'm sure listeners, like everyone has their own story of how life changed for them during COVID. For my husband and I, we were leading a nonprofit. Our sort of constituency, if you want to call them that, but our base of staff and students were international. Most all of them had come from overseas. So in Australia, when our borders tightened, and everything began closing down through COVID, we didn't know if this was going to be months, years. We just had no idea. And so we really encouraged people to discuss with their parents and their mentors and their support people in their home nations and pray and decide what they wanted to do. And almost all of them decided that they wanted to go home and ride this out. So we kind of went from a really thriving, busy hub of activity where we were serving mostly people under 25 and then out into the community. We went from that to like a team of 5 overnight. It was just a wild transition, or a team of 6. Anyway, a small team. And we had been around 20 and then plus students on top of that. So life really changed for us during COVID. I was trying to write. I had suddenly had all the kids home from school doing remote schooling online. Suddenly had our ministry turn upside down. We pivoted to doing more of the community work and feeding programs and some of that sort of thing. So everything just changed. And it was during that time I thought, okay, how do we just make the most of this time? And so I had this vision to run an online event called the Tethered Summit, which Dorina, I invited as one of our speakers. We had like 40, I gathered 40 speakers and I interviewed them on this whole theme of grief and loss, faith and doubt, wholeness, and healing. And it was just like, how do we offer something in the midst of this really weird pandemic time? And for me, there was a crystallizing of what I wanted to do with my next book during that time. So I wanted to run the summit tethered, and then that would lead me into and ease me back into writing because I had just had to stop writing in the midst of all the crazy. And so I thought I'll
Mhm.
run the and that's going to just get all my creative juices going to when I'm finished, I can pivot back into writing. And that's genuinely what I thought I did. My publisher loved the idea of Tethered to Hope, the book. And so away we went. And that was 2020. And then over the next several years, I just hit wall after wall after wall after wall with my writing. It was the most difficult. I thought writing my first book was difficult, and it was because it's my first book, Grace Like Scarlet, is for grieving with hope after miscarriage and loss. So that book is a mixture of memoir, theology, and grief support. And it was hard writing that, for all the reasons. And I had a newborn baby. So, I have memories of like breastfeeding my son, like on a deadline and typing with the other hand, my youngest son. But really writing Tethered felt excruciating. And I had several years of stopping and starting that manuscript and starting over. Um, and yeah, I finally got it across the line and turned it in 2024. So it took me a good 4 years of working on that book. And then, of course, the editing process and all of that. So yeah, it was a long time coming. But my heart for Tethered to Hope is really to provide something for people that have been through a crisis. It's not for when you're in the thick of crisis, but people that have been through some kind of a crisis. And crisis, I don't mean just only a relational breakdown or a diagnosis or a death or something like that, although those are crises. But I also just
Mhm.
mean the crisis of change. Going back to that conversation that I had on the couch all those years ago and realizing that, even parenthood for these young women, were putting them in a crisis. A wonderful crisis, but a crisis nonetheless, where their life was shifted, things were changed, and they had to refigure out their identity on the other side of that. And that's what Tethered to Hope is for. It's for how do you sort of approach and figure out who you are on the other side of a big crisis or change in your life.
I'm so glad that you shared that nuance with us because I think that's the thing that really makes your book unique. There's a lot of books that are out there that kind of meet us in the midst of crisis, which are important too.
Yeah,
But then it's kind of that liminal space or that in between season as you talk about that we really start to wonder okay, what next? Or where am I supposed to be? Or we feel like we're sort of floating out at sea. And I wonder,
yeah.
just based on the book, what encouragement would you give to listeners who feel like they are in that? And I love you describe it this way in your book, the low light of the in between.
Yeah, I think that I would say a few things. One, and I would just say it's really normal to feel out of sorts. I think when you have been through something major in your life, a shift, a crisis, a change, you know that you're not who you used to be. There's pieces of you that are always there, and so it's this paradox of, well, I am who I've always been. I haven't changed, and yet you're going, I have changed. And, this thing, whatever it is, um, in each of our lives, it's changed me and I'm not who I used to be. But I also sort of feel like I'm not yet who I'm going to be. And so that's that middle space, that liminal space I'm talking about is that I'm not who I was, I'm not who I'm going to be. And I guess what I would say to listeners is that that is a really normal place to be, and to feel out of sorts in the aftermath is really normal. And I would say from my own experience and from talking to many, many other people and their liminal experiences, it often does have fuzzy edges. There's not often a very clear entry and exit from these liminal seasons and spaces in our lives, but they don't last forever. The best of analogy I have is like an airport terminal. Airport is that space, that it's a proper space. It's not metaphorical. It's a space between the place you're leaving and the place you're going. And it feels different if you've ever been in transit, fly through Hong Kong. But just because I've flown through Hong Kong doesn't mean I put that on my list of traveled places. It's a transit place. I've changed planes, and it is between where I was coming from and where I'm going, but it's a unique place in its own. And I think that so yeah, I would tell people that it doesn't last, but it is distinct. And there's something to be said for really trying to understand that distinct place of in betweenness before
Mhm.
clawing our way out of it.
Powerful. And I think so relatable. One thing I know about writing books, and you even kind of mentioned that you went through this process over the course of 4 years, is that there's the writing of the book, which is usually kind of a first draft, and then there's the editing, which is sometimes multiple drafts, and then there's the launching the book into the world. And I know, at least in my experience, that that means the message of the book I've written also is working on my own heart in different levels.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about this book for you today. We're recording this in April of 2026. And, how is this book meeting you in your present season? Maybe it's a liminal space that you could articulate now or something different.
My book launched on the 7th, so it's only been a couple of weeks, 3 weeks or something. And there was a couple of days before, it was sometime in the week before my book launch. I just got out Tethered and reread the chapter that I wrote on expectations. It's called The Tyranny of Expectations because I was feeling so much, well, vulnerability around launching a book, which is so completely normal. I can imagine that every new book feels that way to an author, because it's your work put out for the world to judge. And surely that's not why we write it, but the reality is it will be judged. And that's okay. It's not a bad thing, but it's a difficult thing and so vulnerable. But I also just had all of these expectations on myself as well. Myself as a writer, sort of my second book, I know what I'm doing. But launching in what are we in, 2026 is very different to launching in 2018. The whole mediascape is different.
Yes.
Our online habits are different. My life season is different. My capacity is different. I am now in middle age and I've hit perimenopause and my whole like biology is different. So everything
Yes.
about me is different and trying to launch a book and feeling really disappointed in myself with some of the expectations that I carry, but
Mhm.
also some of the expectations and hope that I have for the book. And so I was, yeah, just dealing with, and still am, but dealing with a lot of, yeah, disappointment around expectations. And so I was reading my chapter on the tyranny of expectations, and also I have a chapter on self compassion as a force. And so I think, yeah, I was reading those just going, can I receive this as just a woman, just as me, not as the writer trying to read back through what I've written, but just how does it land just for me today as I
Mhm.
absorb this in? And I'll tell you what, Dorina, like I find it a real challenge to read anything that I do and just receive. So
Mm.
I think I was in two minds when I was reading those chapters. So there's part of me going, yes, this is good. This is truth. Let it speak. Let it sink. Let it go deeper. And then there's the other part of me that's the writer going, oh, I should pull that quote. I hadn't thought about an article like this. And so, you're kind of operating on two
Yeah.
levels. So I would love to, say that like, oh, I just had my cup of coffee and it just spoke to me and my life was transformed in that moment. And then I had this amazing launch. And no, it didn't go like that. But I think it's just that um, constant reminder that we are human, that it's okay to be human, that we can recognize the compassion of God toward us. And I hope use that as fuel to be compassionate to ourselves. And then in the midst of that, I mean, the main message of my book is that whether you feel it or not, you are tethered to hope. And so for me, that is the message. And I do believe that with every fiber in my being that I am tethered to hope. And so on those days when I feel discouraged, when I feel like hope is thin, when I feel overwhelmed with expectations that are being met or
Mhm.
not met or anywhere in between. I think the bottom line is okay, I might be disappointed and that doesn't magically go away, but I'm also tethered. And to me is just such a huge reassurance.
I appreciate your transparency, and I love this because 'cause we're kind of getting, like, the meta narrative and then the narrative of the book itself at the same time, and that's sort of the magic of these conversations that we get to sort of pull back the curtain as authors. But I know this experience well. And I'm thinking about when my book, Breathing Through Grief, came out a few years ago. I remember I had grabbed a copy of it and I was going on a retreat that I was helping. I was actually the chef for this retreat. So here I was in Priest Lake, Idaho, and I had like the first copy of the book. And I remember sitting down on the dock and just beginning to read it. And there's the level of like our editor brain that you were sort of describing where it's like, oh, I should have put this in or, whatever, edited this in a different way, made it more succinct or added more color. But in that moment for me, I was really like challenging myself. How can I receive this message? Not as like, Dorina talking, but as the
Mm.
Holy Spirit talking to me through that process of writing the book. And so I can
Yeah.
relate to what you were saying so much because it was a reminder to me of, okay, this is what it looks like to breathe through grief. And this book that I'm holding is also a testament to what God has done in me in
Uh-huh.
this season, in this time. And I feel that so much with your book, Tethered to Hope, as well. Even as you're describing it, I got to read an early copy because I got to offer an endorsement for this book. But now I'm thinking, oh, I need to read again because I'm also in a new, like, in between space of closing some doors and some chapters in my life for my family and in my writing. And
Mm.
needing to be tethered to that message of hope. I want to push into this a little bit more because I know that a lot of our audience are writers, communicators, creatives, maybe even editors, publishers, folks working in publishing. So,
Uh-huh.
when you think about this message of being tethered to hope, what would you say specifically to that audience in terms of how do we do this? How do we tether ourselves to hope in the midst of a landscape that is just constantly changing for us?
Hmm. Oh, that's a tough question. I think when talking about tethered to hope as a writer, as a someone working in this space, I think it's important to acknowledge just and I touched on it before, but the vulnerability of this profession, the vulnerability and the bravery it takes. And I think I used to think of courage in terms of grand gestures, you know.
Mm,
To me, courage was like, oh, someone's walking on a tightrope across Niagara Falls. Like, that's so courageous. I would never do that, and we kind of might
yeah.
think of these automatic things, like of huge scale. And for most of us, those are really unrealistic. Like I'm never actually going to consider whether or not I would walk on a tightrope across the falls. Like
Right.
it's never going to be an actual choice in my life. But I've realized that courage for most of us looks quiet and
Mm,
it looks unassuming. But it's those small and big decisions we make that directly or even indirectly confront something that makes us afraid,
mm,
And
mhm,
by personality, I'm not a very fearful person. I never have been. But that doesn't make me necessarily a courageous person, And
mm,
eh,
yeah.
I always sort of thought, well, to be courageous, you need to be really afraid and then do something to counter your fear. But what I've realized is that, and I'm not saying I'm never afraid. Of course I am. I'm normal. But what I've realized is that fear, usually in my life, it shows up a little bit quieter and it shows up in my own voice. It shows up as the voice of my critic. It shows
Mhm,
up as the voice of shame sometimes, or of the not enough. Yeah, the not measuring up, those types of things, like I said before, the expectation. And courage is saying, I'm not going to be ruled by that critic.
mhm,
I'm not going to be
mhm,
ruled by that disappointment of my own capacity. I'm not going to be, I'm not going to let it hold me back from doing the good thing I know I'm called to do, just because I don't have this huge team around me that's cheering me on and sharing on all their big platforms and this and that. I think as writers, like one of the most courageous things we can do is actually show up with our work in the world without comparing ourselves to the writer left. And that
Mm-hmm.
is a courageous act and that is a difficult act. And any writer knows how difficult that is. And you can be doing smashingly. You can be doing so well in your own self with your own internal dialogue and think like, I've got this, I've nailed this. I'm not caught up in comparison or jealousy or anything like that. And then you open your phone and you see one
Yeah.
post that changes everything, and all of a sudden you're propelled into jealousy or you're propelled into inadequacy or you're propelled into the not good enough shame spiral or whatever. None of us are beyond that. And even people that we would admire that have huge followings or platforms, they're not beyond that either. They struggle with that too because we're all human. And so to me, bravery in this space or courage in this space is showing up and doing the work despite what our disappointment might tell us,
Mm.
despite our human tendencies that can sometimes trip us up, and actually embracing our humanity and going, well, my humanity is not just this burden that sucks me into comparison, but my humanity is my gift because I see that
Yeah.
I need God in the midst of this. And I, I need to be reminded about who I am by God. And so that humanity is a wonderful thing because it is one of the ways that we stay tethered to God and we realize we're not God.
Mm.
So yeah, I think courage is something that we maybe don't talk about enough as writers, but we really do need. And it's not courage to just write the book or share that scary story. It's courage to keep showing up when things feel difficult. It's courage to give yourself grace when you need to give yourself grace and cut yourself some slack when you need to cut yourself some slack. So courage can take lots of forms, but it's often quiet and unassuming, but incredibly critical if we're going to stay sane and stay grounded in a profession like this.
Yes, yes, yes. You are preaching to me today. I hope that it is also encouraging to our sisters who are listening. One of the things I love about your book is that you also take some space to offer these practices and postures that form us, especially looking at part 4 of your book. And I just kind of in by way of closing, I wonder why you decided to do that or what you wanted to offer the reader through.
A lot of that's what I've just been talking about, actually. Courage as a
Yeah.
practice,
Yeah.
humility as a gateway, befriending curiosity, trust anyway, and open eyed surrender. Those are the chapters in that section. I think when I first started writing Tethered to Hope in 2020, my approach was, okay, I'm going to write a book about staying tethered to hope. What are the practices that we can employ that will keep us tethered? And I really thought the whole book was going to be sort of full of that, full of practices. I was, to go full circle back to the beginning of our interview today, our conversation today. I told you I stopped and started the writing so many times and I threw away so much. And I think one of the walls I kept hitting was I was really approaching it from what are the practices that keep us tethered? And I had this moment, and it was a writing moment because I was struggling with the writing and I was so frustrated. I wanted to just smash my computer. I was in tears. I remember thinking, God, I don't think I can
Mm.
write this book that I thought I could write, and it is not working for me. And I have tried and started over so many times, and I was feeling just so beside myself with all of it. And to the point where I actually laid on the floor. It's so embarrassing, but I did. I laid on the floor and I was just crying. I was just like, what do I do? And I had this moment where I felt like God just gently showed me it's not about you staying tethered to hope. It's about you realizing you're already tethered and nothing can
Mm.
change that. And I realized that, okay, it's actually not up to me to employ the right practices so that I stay tethered to hope. I have to just know and understand that I'm tethered no matter what I do or don't do. And
Yeah.
so I have to preface the answer to your question with that to say these practices aren't things that tether us to God. We're tethered to God
Mm. Mhm. Mhm.
because of who God is and because of who we are. It's like an umbilical cord that runs between us. Like it's not a tether to keep us in, it's a tether to give life. But there are practices I think that can help shape us in those in between seasons. And that's really what I was trying to write into in this practice. And so it's looking at in this section of the book, it's looking at humility and knowing and understanding that humility sort of sets the stage for us for all of the other any other practice that's going to serve us in our spiritual life. Humility is the gateway to that. If we're not able to be honest about where we're at and who we are, and I don't just mean our weaknesses. Sometimes we think about humility as just as a lowly thing, and I don't think that's really what humility means. Humility has to do with being human. I don't know. Sorry, I don't want to get on the tangent because I've written all about that a whole chapter, but it has to do with just knowing who you are, your strengths and your weaknesses, and then being able to approach the rest from that position of knowing who you are. And um,
Mhm.
and then curiosity is all about like examining your desires, but then examining like the thing under the thing. So not being afraid of your
Yeah.
desires, but actually being willing to assess your desires in the light of God's care and go, what are these desires actually speaking to on a deeper level? Where do these desires come from? What is it saying about me and the way I want to move in the world, connect with God? And we can often think like desire is selfish, and sometimes it is selfish. But usually, even under those quote selfish desires, is something real and something genuine that needs to be addressed. And so, yeah,
Mm.
being curious with our lives and not being dismissive of ourselves. Sometimes we can be so curious about other people and we can care so much about their pain and their
Yeah.
journeys and their stories. And we want to help unpack them. Why do you think that way? And why did you make this decision? But we don't have that sort of same curiosity for ourselves because we just feel like we should know better, or do better, or feel
Yeah.
better, you know? But it's, yeah, being curious with our own desires, being curious with ourselves, and then that courage as a practice, which I already talked about, and then being willing to trust. And I don't mean trust as just an exercise of the mind, I will or I won't trust, but I mean trust as an act of surrender. And those two things, trust and surrender, are really intimately linked. And so living our lives in such a way that actually um, leans in to the truth that we're
Mm.
already tethered. That takes trust because we don't always feel that tether. We don't always feel that hope. We don't always see or recognize God's quiet kindness that's sprinkled in those seasons of difficulty and change and liminality, but they're there. And so to
Mm.
really trust God to lean in where things feel vulnerable or difficult so that we can quiet ourselves enough to hear and see what God is doing in those spaces.
Thanks for walking us through that. I hope that our listeners, your interest has been piqued in this new book. It's called Tethered to Hope: The Quiet Kindness of God in Crisis, Change, and the Spaces in Between. I love the cover.
Thank
And
you.
Adriel, thank you so much for doing this deep work, for sharing your heart with us today, and truly being vulnerable with us about even a bit of the writer's life and some of that behind the scenes, which I think is important and relatable for all of us. So if people are interested in supporting you and your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, I write a Substack called The Foundry, so you can find me on Substack. And I'm also on Instagram. Adriel Booker is my handle, so pretty easy to find.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your story. And I'm excited for more people to get this book into their hands. Blessings to you, my friend.
Thank you. Great to chat with you, Dorina.
Wasn't that a meaningful conversation that we had with Adriel? I'm so grateful for just her willingness to share some of her experiences in writing Tethered to Hope. And I want to thank you for joining us for the Redbud podcast today. If you would like to learn a little bit more about the Redbud Writers Guild, I want to just encourage you to hop over to our website, redbudwritersguild.com. You can find that link in the show notes as well. There's lots of details about our sisterhood, and we also have a bookstore there, so you can see all of the many different books in different genres that are written by our members. We love to share our members' work. We're so proud of them. And I want to just give a little plug that these books make meaningful gifts. So I hope that you will check those out. Also, we provide resources for Christian women writers and communicators. And one of the ways that we do that is through our monthly webinars. Now, those webinars are free for our Redbud members, and we offer them to the public as well. And so we have one coming up on May 7th that is going to be led by our friend and also the vice president of Redbud, Marie Chan. And this webinar is giving us ideas of how to provide helpful resources to build connection, community, and increased reader engagement with your book. And I love this because Marie is just such a maven at this. She is inviting you to come and gain new ideas on how to write a guide to complement your book and provide those helpful resources to build connection and community. So you're going to learn some creative tips for writing your own resource guide. This is just a fantastic way also to connect with the Redbud Writers Guild community. So we will put details about that webinar in our show notes. You can sign up on Eventbrite. It is a suggested donation of $15, which goes towards our mentoring program and our scholarships. And we would love to have you join our circle in that way. Redbud Writers Guild is open for new members in October of every year. So just kind of looking ahead, if it's something you would like to explore maybe over the summer, and then those official applications go up in October. And thank you for spending some time with me today. Go in peace, my friends.